My opinion of the shutdown is that it's very unfortunate that the government is shutting down, but it's unfortunate that the government has found it necessary on several occasions now to exceed the debt ceiling. And as a result, we have these clashes between the administration and its opponents, and there's always some pretext for not allowing the budget to be passed and not allowing the debt ceiling, which is going to be the next issue, I should say, to be exceeded. But on some level, I feel that if it weren't for these things, we would have no limit on the size of the government and on the size of the debt. And at some point, a line should be drawn that cannot be crossed any further. So I do not agree with the Republican strategy of treating the budget as a way of trying to defeat Obamacare. I think in the long run that is going to backfire because it will cause people to conclude that any problems with the operation of the new system may be due to the lack of adequate funding. I think the best thing that can be done to demonstrate that Obamacare has to be repealed is to allow it to actually operate for some time with no constraints, in which case people will see that even without any artificial budget constraint, the system does not do what it is supposed to do, and then we can have some real progress toward dismantling it. I don't think Alan Greenspan is solely to blame or even largely to blame for the financial crisis. I think, though, that his Federal Reserve contributed to the general environment that made the crisis take place by being responsible for the credit conditions that made it easier and even more tempting than it would have been for subprime lending to proceed to such dramatic levels. That being said, we should never lose track of the many other factors that contributed both in the United States but also elsewhere in the world to the severity of this crisis. It wasn't just a failure of monetary policy, but monetary policy could have done a better job constraining the boom. I think that the Fed, since the crisis, has done many very bad things. First of all, I think it did a terrible thing by rescuing Bear Stearns. That made the too big to fail status of all the other large financial institutions seem all but certain, and thus contributed to the severe shock that the financial markets felt when Lehman Brothers was in fact allowed to fail. I think a policy that would have let Bear Stearns fail would also have been one that could have been continued by allowing Lehman and others to fail without such severe adverse repercussions as we actually experienced. Quantitative easing has also been a very mixed bag at best. The quantitative easing that was most necessary didn't take place, and that would have been the easing immediately following the collapse of October 2008. Instead, the Federal Reserve was so anxious to rescue insolvent investment banks that it was purchasing their assets while sterilizing those loans, essentially, or those funds, that funding, by selling bonds on the market. This had the effect of contracting funds or credit for the sound financial system while rewarding the unsound parts of the system. So there was no genuine quantitative easing at first. There might have been genuine easing, and at that time it would have been very potentially quite productive. Later, when the easing really took its stride, and particularly during the last round of QE3, which is still going on, it isn't clear at all that easing was called for. We're now several years after the crisis. Total spending in the economy has returned and indeed exceeded its pre-crisis level. It's not even clear that we are below what would have been the trend line had there been no crisis. We certainly aren't very far below. And that means that it's quite unlikely, at least it's unlikely in my opinion, that the persistent unemployment in the United States, which of course is rather low compared to here in Spain, but is still above what Americans wish it were, it's very unlikely that the persistent unemployment is traceable to a lack of liquidity in the economy. I do not think that that is the problem anymore. And so I don't think quantitative easing is doing any good. It could conceivably be doing harm. Well, all that I can gather from these proposals for banking union and also for the European stability mechanism is that the very moral hazard problems that have contributed to not the breakdown of the euro as an official currency, but to the breakdown of fiscal responsibility within the eurozone, that moral hazard problem seems to be one that will be codified and most likely worsened by these new arrangements. Either that or the new arrangements will have to be followed by further fiscal consolidation, and what the outcome of that will be is anybody's guess. I certainly wouldn't venture to say what the consequences will be. But unless there is actually some kind of fiscal consolidation whereby you have, in effect, central control of the actual government budgets, I don't see how these other measures can fail to lead to even greater abuse and even greater government deficits and the problems consequent to those than have been experienced so far. It's evident that the economic downturn in Europe, first of all, is a downturn that is very different in the various economies involved in the Eurozone. And here I have to say that I think that the old Keynesian arguments about the danger of having a single currency and single central bank for a group of heterogeneous economies where resources and capital don't flow easily across borders, but particularly services and labor, we have a central bank confronted with the dire situation of some countries with over 20% unemployment and others with less than 5% unemployment, all within its zone, and faced as well with an inflation rate that until very recently had exceeded its 2% target slightly, or its below 2% target. Now it is well below again, according to the latest statistics. This gives the ECB a little bit of legroom to play with, but it is still going to run up against that limit. And the problem is that if it exceeds that limit, then it will have no mandate to work with at all, and then it's anyone's guess how far it will go, both in providing general liquidity and, let's face it, in acquiring sovereign debt of particularly troubled countries in the open market. So it's a very messy situation.